What's up, everybody? What's up, MGTOW? So this video is going to be on slavery FUD. If you don't know what FUD is, it's fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Now, before I even get started, I can already predict, most black people are going to say, you're a coon, you sound white, Uncle Tom, what's some other ones? I can't even think of any. Oreo. You'll probably come up with some good ones in the comments. But just to preemptively kind of argue against these kind of stupid talking points, first of all, I would almost say that it's an ethical, an ethos type of rhetoric, but in reality, it's more of a pathos type of rhetoric because you're just insulting me to try to make me feel a certain way. You don't actually have a logical argument. So by definition, if you're trying to use emotional rhetoric against someone, that's pathos. So technically, your arguments are pathetic. And since my arguments are logical, it's logos, which is logic. But in any case, there's going to be basically two groups of people that are trying to counter-argue against this point. And one of them is going to be black people, and the other one's going to be women. Now, to cut off the argument of black people arguing against this, and specifically black men arguing against my point, basically, if you try to argue against my point, then in any way, shape, or form, you will be arguing that black men need the help of the government, number one, and basically the help of the government read white men's tax money. So if you want to argue against my points, then you will be arguing for black men's dependency on white men, period. That is how it will be if you try to argue against my point. Now, second people that are going to try to argue against it is going to be third wave feminists, those that thought that feminism was about equality, which it really isn't. And there's a pretty good video by Marcus, which is the groundwork for the Metaphysics of MGTOW channel. And he has pretty irrefutable logic that feminism was never about equality. So I'll post that video down below. And also, your trans exclusionary radical feminists will also try to argue against this point, I guess. But it's probably mainly going to be kind of like your third wave, we thought it was about equality type of feminists. So what is the point? What is the argument? Well, slavery FUD kind of takes form in a few ways. I mean, the main point of it is the whole concept of white supremacy, which is ridiculous on its face. Sure, in the past, it did exist. There was systematic blockage of black men, black people from owning property and getting certain civil rights and things like that. But that doesn't exist anymore. And any type of quote unquote white supremacy, to me, is starting to look a lot like the wage gap. So I guess from my perspective, when I see this, it puts me in a similar position to a third wave feminist because, for example, the third wave feminists and the trans exclusionary radical feminists, they can't go as far down the line of intersectionality to the point where they can say that M2F transgender person is a woman, because then they would have to let them take all the scholarships away from women in sports. And, possibly we could see an M2F winning Olympic championships, right? So a third wave feminist has to accept on some level that there are biological differences between men and women, because otherwise they would just go full fourth wave feminist, intersectionality. But they don't want that because they want, women to have a certain amount of power, biological or cisgendered women, right? So they're kind of stuck in a past because they don't want to they want to admit biologically that there's differences between men and women, but those biological differences aren't enough that we need to create different social structures for men and women, right? Because they don't want to admit that men and women are different, but they do want to admit that men and women are different when it comes to allowing trans people into getting stuff that was allotted for women, right? So the problem with affirmative action, right, is that a lot of that stuff was specifically allotted to black men. And the problem is that these third wave feminists try to equate being a housewife, and specifically a white housewife, with the plight that black men went through in slavery. So this is where the slavery FUD comes in. Because when they're suggesting white supremacy, what they're kind of implicitly, if not explicitly, suggesting is something along the lines of that, well, if Joe Biden wasn't in office, you'd be going back to being a slave, right? Like, if we left Trump in office and quote unquote white supremacy took over, then we would be back in the fields picking cotton, which ironically enough, a huge majority of the cotton that was picked went to making clothes for white women. So go figure, right? So they're trying to convince black men that they're in the same boat as white women. Like, oh yeah, well, if we have to go back to being housewives, you're going to go back into the field picking cotton. But that's a very bad false equivalency. Because see, the difference between black men and women is that when black men were slaves, the laws were impeding their progress. And at the time, there was plenty of rich white women that owned property. Like, you can look it up historically. For instance, the Queen of England. I mean, was the Queen of England a slave, like a housewife slave, or did she own property? I'm pretty sure the Queen of England owned a lot of property. I've heard something about the sun never setting on the British Empire. Okay. But you can see kind of where I'm coming from with this, where it's like they're trying to push this slavery FUD or this white supremacy FUD onto black men, basically to keep them in the Democrat Party. You can see because they're at an impasse, because if we get rid of affirmative action, then a lot less women will be in high levels in business and getting high paid jobs, and then therefore a larger majority of women would have to go back to being housewives. Whereas if you take away the affirmative action laws for black men, all black men are going to do is create their own jobs and create their own economy. And we've seen it before with Black Wall Street. So the argument that, if we get rid of discrimination laws and we get rid of affirmative action, that black people will end up being slaves again is false. But it is much more likely that a larger percentage of women would end up being housewives if we got rid of affirmative action. So now I'm going to make the moral argument for getting rid of affirmative action, because it's basically kindergarten ethics, right? If 3 people are racing and they're running a mile-long race, and then you show up at the end and someone puts you in the second place position and you're not doing anything, obviously that's wrong. That's obviously wrong. Like, everybody knows that's wrong. If you weren't in the race, you shouldn't be getting put up on the podium as a winner. Like, that's just basic ethics 101. Now, the counter argument to that would be that there should be some type of demographic parity in companies. And that may be true and that may be justifiable. And I would say also that it is possibly justifiable for huge, basically monopolistic corporations like Google and Amazon and things like that, that they should have to hire a certain amount of people into entry-level jobs. Now, note that I'm saying entry-level jobs, not middle management, not CEO positions. But yes, if there is some type of demographic problem or whatever, I would say that is justifiable to at least give people a chance to prove themselves. Like, for instance, any characteristic, for example, short people are biased against it. It's pretty obvious from the statistics. So if a company doesn't have a certain amount of guys under 5'4" working, then they should allow for a certain amount to be put into entry-level positions so that then they can then prove that they can do the work and that they're productive people. And I think that's justifiable. But putting people into CEO positions that are underqualified or middle management or upper management, that's not fair to anyone. It's not fair to the person that's underqualified, and it's also not fair to the people that actually went through the ranks in whatever the prescribed manner was. So, to me, the whole slavery FUD that the female feminists are trying to push onto black men to make you think that, oh, white supremacy is going to come and get you and you're going to be back in the field picking cotton, it's just a horrible argument. Because if anything, from things like Black Wall Street, we can see that black men would be doing just fine. Granted, maybe we wouldn't be the top, most superior people on the planet. I don't think anybody is, but we would make it. We would survive. I mean, even if they completely brought back segregation, I'm pretty sure we would survive. And if you want to argue against me, then basically you're saying that you don't believe that black people could survive without white people. You see what I'm saying? Like, it's ridiculous. Like, so you can call me a coon, Uncle Tom, and whatever, but while you're doing that, you're basically saying that black people can't make it on their own and that they need white people in the government to protect them. Now, I'm not saying that we should have laws that impede black men's process. Of course, black men should have the same rights as everybody else, and everybody should have the same rights. Women, men, gay, straight, trans. If you want to be a bagel, I don't care, really. I mean, I don't care what you want to be called and how you want to dress. But when it comes to certain aspects of biological life, like for instance, say being a woman and being able to get pregnant, like that's a real thing. It really happens. And for example, we can see that when you give women money, they stop having kids. So it's like, yeah, I said I was going to get back to the whole hypergamy thing, but you can see, okay, yeah, granted, less women are marrying up, but also less women are marrying, period. And also less women are having children. And so that's kind of hurting the human race. Whereas, if you just stop giving black men affirmative action or even completely segregate black men from white society, it wouldn't in fact, it would probably increase the birth rate within the black community. Like if you look statistically, that if you give black women a bunch of affirmative action jobs and raise their hypergamy status above that, which is the average earnings level for black men, you're actually hurting society and you're actually lowering the birth rates. So you could see there are a lot of parallels between, the arguments made by people about black men and women. Because, for instance, the wage gap thing, which black people like to call white supremacy, is really just the wage gap. It's just there's some biological differences and some cultural differences that cause black people and white people to choose different jobs. And some of those jobs pay more than others, at least in the current situation. And so, therefore, to me personally, that's all. I just see white supremacy as the wage gap. And so, of course, a third wave feminist, she doesn't want to go back to being a housewife. So she's going to argue against it, and then she's going to try to get black people on board and say, oh, well, housewifery and slavery are basically the same thing. And they're really not. They're really not, because housewives actually benefit society by creating more people, and good people to populate the society and produce more, whereas slavery just harms people. It just stops their progress. It stops them from being able to achieve anything in life. And then you're taking their property away from them and their labor away from them. There's a big difference between being a housewife and a slave. I'm sorry. And if you try to conflate the two, that's really showing something about what you think. That's crazy. That's below the bigotry of low expectations. It's like saying, well, if Joe Biden wasn't here to give you rights, then you'd be a slave and you'd be picking cotton. Yeah, but women would be housewives too. And it's like, you're trying to say that's the same thing. It's not. It's really not. So that's really just the point of the video, is that, please don't try to conflate being a housewife with being a slave, because it's not the same thing at all. All right. So that's all I got for this one. Have a good day and go MGTOW.